This is a Phono podcast.
Phono decided to explore the 19th century origins of our wonderful green spaces and created a 4-part series, Our Green and Pleasant Town. Episode 3, Honour and Ornament, Nottingham's Arboretum, tells the often contentious and riotous story of our park's radical beginnings.
Nottingham's Arboretum truly is the People's Park.
Because it was not part of the Town Council's original proposal.
Back in 1845, when Nottingham's Enclosure Act was passed, the council planned a 5th public walk to begin at Canning Circus.
And take you beside the General Cemetery up to Mansfield Road and on to Elm Avenue.
But the people of Nottingham had other ideas. They wanted a pleasure ground to rival Derby's Arboretum, which had opened 5 years earlier. They brought pressure to bear and petitioned the council, as the Nottingham Review reported.
A proposition has been conveyed to us by an influential inhabitant of our town which we think most worthy of consideration. It is proposed that the 60 acres of land placed at the disposal of the corporation for the recreation of the people should be employed so as to provide our townsmen with an arboretum, public baths and a new cricket ground open to all. The arboretum to occupy about 15 acres, so that instead of a number of new walks, the rusticity and beauty of which would soon be destroyed by the erection of buildings on each side, a permanent provision would be made for the cultivation of taste, the preservation of health and the enjoyment of innocent recreation.
And so the council bowed to public pressure. The 5th walk was abandoned and our arboretum created instead.
Laid out in the sandfield with splendid pineapple-topped gate piers flanking the entrance from Waverley Street.
Step through and you'll find a small lake to your left and a central path that winds through a valley, well planted with trees and shrubs.
All clearly labelled, for this was to be a place of rational recreation, where you could learn about the natural beauties you were enjoying.
Follow the path across the valley and it will bring you out again through a tunnel under Addison Street. It was from this tunnel that the mayor, William Felkin, processed at the head of the corporation into the Arboretum on its grand opening day, the 11th of May, 1852. A proud day for William Felkin, the man who'd long campaigned for enclosure, as he now remembers.
A proud day indeed. A red letter day, not just for me, for everyone. Thousands upon thousands of people came from far and wide, many of them by railway, of course. Now there's progress for you. A horse, or if you were less fortunate, Shanks's pony, used to be your only means of travelling into town. But thanks to the new railway, we watched people flood in at the slightest expense and with the utmost ease. I'm told there was a perfect sea of heads rippling from the railway station through the town, right across the roads and new streets into the Arboretum. As the clock struck 2, we threw open the doors of the Exchange Hall and began our procession to the Arboretum. We looked and felt magnificent. I'll never forget it. The Pindars in their livery of green and silver lace and pink stockings. The bellman and sheriff's officers were in scarlet and silver lace. Mr. Meldrum, the mayor's sergeant, looked particularly splendid in a blue cloak trimmed with gold lace and a splendid new cocked hat. And he carried the large gold mace resting over his shoulder. Of course, as mayor that year, I wore my chain and robes. I'm a plain sort of man for the most part, and I don't go in for airs and graces, as a rule. But on that day, I felt it was only right and proper to honour the work we'd done in bringing about enclosure and giving the people of Nottingham these green spaces. The streets were crowded and people cheered as we marched past with the band playing. We came into the Arboretum through the tunnel at the eastern gate and processed all the walks. I was called upon to make a speech, and I like to think it was well received. Naturally, I paid tribute to those who'd campaigned for the enclosure. Noble-spirited men with not a shilling's direct interest in it, but who fought that great battle, fought and won. But it wasn't a day for dwelling on the past. We were making history that day, giving the people of Nottingham green spaces and pleasure grounds that would inspire and educate our young people for generations to come. It was a splendid day. Everything went off perfectly, and I was proud to be part of it.
It might have been perfect for you, Mr. Felkin, in your fancy clothes and with your fancy dinner to look forward to. Some of us had quite a different sort of day, I can tell you. They even went and put my name in the newspaper. My poor mother must have been turning in her grave.
Oh, well, I'm very sorry to hear that, I'm sure, Mrs.
Bullock, Mary Bullock, and it's Miss. I'm the daughter of the ice and green glove maker Horatio Nelson Bullock. We lost my mother in 1849. I've been keeping house for father ever since.
Miss Bullock, to be sure. Yes, indeed. And what had you done to get your name into the newspaper?
Me? I'd done nothing. I'm a respectable young woman, and I don't take kindly to my name being bandied about in print like that. I was a victim, sir, robbed in the refreshment rooms. Those sticky-fingered vagabonds picked my pocket, took 5 and 6, and that's money I can't afford to lose. And it wouldn't have happened if the day had been properly set up. If you ask me, it was a shambles, start to finish.
Oh yes, well, I'm very sorry that you lost your pocket. No one knows better than I do how hard our mill and factory hands have to work to earn a decent wage. That's why the corporation created these green spaces for the people. But really, my dear, I think you're being a little harsh. Understandably in the circumstances, of course, but you must allow it was a splendid day with very little to spoil our enjoyment.
Well, it spoilt my enjoyment. Not that I was enjoying it much to begin with. There was just too many people crammed into town. You hadn't room to breathe. Not that you wanted to breathe all the smoke. Everywhere you turned there was men smoking pipes and men smoking cigars. Pretty near smoked us out. Couldn't get the stink out of my dress no matter how much I aired it. And it had burn marks on it. That was my best dress too. We couldn't even squeeze into the park to begin with, so father and I found a spot on the road overlooking it and watched from there. Folks was all we could see. I can't think why you let 'em all in at the same time. They had to trample on all the grass and the flower beds 'cause the paths weren't enough. Made a right mess of your procession, didn't they? All your councillors and such couldn't follow on the paths because of the crowds, and one lot had to turn off to the right and another to the left, and your grand procession was all broken up and all wandering about for ages looking for you, and you without an inkling of what was going on. Father and I near died laughing at you, and when we did get into the park later it was no better. My feet were tapping to the music from the bands, but there wasn't room to swing a cat, never mind dance. And when you wanted to take a bit of a breather and wet your whistle, you had to push and shove your way into the refreshment rooms, and then there were no waiters. Folk were just helping themselves, and those that were honest were just putting the money down on the stalls or handing it to anyone who looked like they might be a waiter. And that's when someone helped themselves to my pocket and pinched my money.
I did hear the refreshment rooms were poorly staffed with waiters, but you can't blame the corporation for that, you know. We let the refreshment rooms to Mr. Fern, so you ought properly to address yourself to him on that score. The important thing is that Nottingham now has an arboretum to be proud of, and I hope that you and your father will spend many a quiet morning there enjoying its beauty.
Chance would be a fine thing. You keep harping on about it being the People's Park, but we have to pay to get in. You took away our common lands and now you're taking our money just so we can enjoy them. And you expect us to thank you for the privilege? Well, you'll get no thanks from me.
It seems that the corporation and the enclosure committee had little thanks from anyone for their innovative measures in creating green spaces for the town of Nottingham.
And that was due in large part to their decision to charge for admission to the Arboretum on 4 days of the week.
A decision that was not as unreasonable as it first appears. The idea of free public institutions was still in its infancy. The majority of parks and pleasure grounds, like the newly created Arboretum at Derby, were self-supporting and relied on the income from admission charges to pay the maintenance and management costs.
Nottingham's enclosure committee looked to the example of the Derby Arboretum when it came to setting the level of admission fees. Nottingham's Arboretum was to be open free of charge on Sundays, Mondays and Wednesdays only, and would not open until 12:30 on a Sunday, to keep the morning free for church. The rest of the week it cost 6pence for adults and persons over the age of 14 and 3pence for children.
Unless you could afford to pay for an annual subscription. This cost £1 for a family and 5 shillings for an individual and had to be paid in advance on the 1st of May each year. Smoking was strictly forbidden within the grounds and also in the refreshment rooms, and no refreshments were to be sold on Sundays.
Controversy surrounded the admission charges from the beginning. Even the enclosure committee were not unanimously behind the decision. Over the next 5 years, a campaign to abolish them raged through the town, spearheaded by the Nottingham Journal. This newspaper denounced the charges as
an unholy attempt to extort money from the public,
and jeered that
the corporation has become fairly demented with respect to the Arboretum, which they have turned into a ridiculous and expensive plaything, and aristocratically exclusive as they, in their wisdom and whim, may think proper.
The campaign to abolish the admission fees became as heated and charged as any political election. Placards and handbills were printed and circulated around the town.
The newspapers devoted many column inches to the debate, and letters to the editors on the topic were numerous.
Things came to a head in April 1857 after hundreds of people signed a petition against the charges, asking the mayor, John Bradley, to call a public meeting to debate the issue. A meeting where tempers ran high and the corporation were left in no doubt as to the depth of public feeling. Alderman William Felkin and local solicitor and councillor William Parsons recall that turbulent time over a quiet drink in the George IV.
In my opinion, the newspapers were out of order, Felkin. Their reporting of the Arboretum question was irresponsible, extremely irresponsible. They caused the ill feeling, you know. They whipped up public opinion against us.
You can't lay all the blame on the gentlemen of the press. There was a strong public feeling against admission charges, and the papers reported it with great enthusiasm. Can't blame them for that. It was a rollicking good story. We must have freedom of speech, you know. Cheers.
Yes, cheers. But there have to be boundaries, Felkin, and I say they crossed them. At least the Journal did. They deliberately misrepresented our opinions and were personally abusive of us, particularly me and Edwin Patchett. They vilified us, and the trouble is, If a chap reads something in the newspaper, he believes it to be true, no matter how outrageous.
Ah, they did lay into poor Patchett. What was it they said? Something about his using disreputable tactics he'd picked up working in court, defending low, designing and artful criminals. That he shamelessly called white black and black white in trying to carry his point. Well, he was bound to bear the brunt of it, being chairman of the management committee. Oh, and I seem to remember them saying he was intoxicated by his own eloquence, drunk with the cheers of his subservient supporters. I suppose that would be you, Parsons. You were his right-hand man after all.
I stood by the admission charges then, and I still do. There was never any question of trying to exclude people from the Arboretum, and we were willing to increase the number of free days if that's what people wanted. But it costs money to run and maintain these parks. They need to be self-supporting, not reliant on the corporation's goodwill to fund them. By keeping the park closed, other than to ticket holders for part of the week, we made sure there was a top-class park for everyone to enjoy. But I know you weren't in favour of it, and you won in the end.
I wouldn't put it quite like that, Parsons. I fully approved of the way the Arboretum was managed, and I said so at the time. But it's true, I'd always doubted that it was legal to charge for admission to a place set aside in law for the free use of the people of Nottingham, forever. Our Arboretum wasn't like the one in Derby. It wasn't built with private funds. Anyway, I could see the debate was getting out of hand, so I stepped in and said we shouldn't do anything until we'd taken legal advice. And I'd think you'd be grateful I did, seeing as legal counsel agreed and concluded it was illegal to charge for admission to the Arboretum. Saved your bacon, I reckon.
Of course, there was no question of going against learned counsel's opinion, though I'm still not convinced we were acting illegally. But that had to be an end of it, and so we took down the gates at both entrances to keep the park open. And how did the Journal respond? Accused us of behaving like spoilt children and had people believing we meant to sell or destroy the Arboretum out of spite. Honestly, you can't win with these people.
Yeah, you've got to admit that was a bit of an overreaction. Your argument, the Arboretum had to be kept open all night, same as the walks, just didn't wash. But at least you saw sense in the end and put the gates back up.
Well, they've got the park they wanted now. Open, free to everyone all week, even if we've had to cut back on some of the attractions because we can't afford them anymore. I was sorry to see the swans go, I must say. Always thought they were the most graceful birds. Made you feel quite poetic. Oh well, time for another pint, Felkin, old chap.
Won't say no, but here, aren't you supposed to be teetotal these days?
I did try, but giving up drinking altogether just doesn't agree with me. Even Mrs. Parsons could see I was suffering as much from the lack as from the surfeit. She's advised me to try drinking in moderation instead. Oh well, maybe just a half.
And so Nottingham became one of the first towns to offer a free public park for everyone's benefit.
It was an innovative and radical measure, quite ahead of its time.
But not everyone approved. Look, there's the stockbroker Samuel Collinson taking his customary stroll through the Arboretum and thinking about the changes since the admission charges were abolished.
If you want my opinion, they've quite spoiled this beautiful place. They should have let well alone, but that wouldn't do for those fools at the town hall. First they had a public meeting about doing away with the admission charges, but it was all one way. No opposition was allowed. So it seemed as though the park must be opened free of charge 7 days a week. Then they had a town council meeting that proposed quite the opposite, until Alderman Felkin raised the question of whether the corporation was acting legally in charging for entry. And when legal opinion came down against making any charges for admission, the committee at once took the gates down and threw it open, without any planning or forethought. It's a nice mess, brought on by a parcel of popularity-hunting humbugs. I've been in the Arboretum after a gala or fete day to see how it fared from the crowds in the past. And whilst the grass was much trampled, there was no harm done. But that was after an occasional event. Now the Arboretum is open to all and sundry all the week. That sort of damage is being done every day. The place seems to be merely a huge playground for young girls and boys, and in the evenings is full of people. There are great numbers dancing, playing tag and kissing games. Just look at how the grass is trampled and trodden, and the banks broken down. And who will have to pay for the pinders and gardeners to repair and maintain the park? Us ratepayers, that's who, whether you use the Arboretum or not. Of course, people get the wrong idea when they're told the park belongs to them and is open every day in the week. They think they've a right to take away the flowers and behave as they like. Only the other day I read in the newspaper a number of cases in the magistrate's court where men and women had been found picking the flowers just as if they were in their own gardens. And a group of boys were caught stealing duck eggs. The council have posted handbills everywhere against it, but nobody takes any notice of them. No, it won't be the same. But then the Arboretum's charm was all gone from me before all this. After my dear wife's passing, it can bring but sad recollections and regrets.
The loss of revenue when the Arboretum was no longer self-supporting did have an impact on the attractions on offer. The numbers of staff had to be reduced, and responsibility for supervising the Arboretum was delegated to the police.
The practice of celebrating the anniversary of the opening of the park with a public holiday and a range of entertainments was also discontinued, which was a shame as these events drew thousands of visitors into Nottingham. A popular attraction was an ascent by an aeronaut in a Montgolfier balloon, with the thrilling opportunity it brought of paying to go up in the balloon for a partial ascent while it remained safely tethered. An event never free from danger, as Mr. Cullen recalls of his balloon flight from the Arboretum in 1855.
Many were predicting Mr. Green would not venture to go up at all. He had a deal of trouble getting the balloon inflated. As I watched the wind buffeting it violently, I confess I almost hoped he would call the flight off. But once she was up, she was a splendid sight, a beautiful Montgolfier called Le Continent, with diameter of 40 feet, decorated with pictures of the 12 signs of the zodiac and inscriptions in letters 5 feet high. Mr. Green told me she cost him upwards of £500. It was a risky venture, I suppose, given the weather, but Mr. Green was confident he could manage it. So I said I was game, though my heart was in my mouth. And so we cast off at a few minutes past 6. It wasn't a smooth ascent. Le Continent darted upwards immediately as if she'd been straining at the leash, but a violent concussion from the air pressure on the top of her dome dashed her down again, and we collided with the roof of a neighbouring house. That was a hairy moment as the wicker car scraped across the roof for about 1.5 yards, throwing me against Mr. Green, who, luckily, caught hold of me. Otherwise, I fear I might have toppled out. But soon enough, Le Continent righted herself and began to ascend without further mishap. Mr. Green waved his hat and some flags over the side to let the crowds know we were safe, and we could just hear their enthusiastic cheering as we soared above the Arboretum. What a strange contrast the busy scene below us made with the feeling of peace and quiet in the car. We ascended steadily and rapidly and had an enchanting view of the fields and hamlets below us. The air was remarkably still, and I was struck by the silence. I couldn't even hear the birds. There was no sense of motion, and the wind felt much less violent. It felt like we were in another world. Then we entered dense cloud. With the serenely beautiful blue sky above us, we drifted over a sea of vapoury clouds, as though we transcended this earthly life. I've never experienced anything like it, and I doubt I shall again. But all good things come to an end, and what a sticky end of it we had on that day. After about 40 minutes, Mr. Green decided it was time to descend, fixed upon his spot, and opened up the valve. Down we came to earth. The grappling irons were thrown out, and I felt the tug as they took hold. I'm told it would have been an exemplary descent, had it not been for the violent wind that propelled the continent in a horizontal direction at great speed. The tethering rope snapped, and we were off again, drifting with terrifying velocity only a few feet above the ground. There was no controlling the balloon, and I have to confess I began to say my prayers as we kept hitting the ground, bouncing erratically. We dashed through and destroyed numerous hedges and fields, until we were saved at last by the continent colliding with a tree and becoming embedded in its branches. Green and I were both pretty shaken, but miraculously both of us came away with nothing more than scratches and bruises. But the continent was lost. Mr. Green had to cut that tree down to free her, but she was beyond repair, her silk all frayed and torn to threads. It was a severe financial blow to him, I'm afraid, but one of the most exciting anniversary fetes we ever had at the Arboretum.
Even without the anniversary fetes and gala events, the Arboretum became a popular place for recreation, especially amongst families, although it continued to court controversy. In 1859, the corporation bowed to public pressure once again when they erected a statue in the Arboretum to the Chartist MP Fergus O'Connor. The Chartist movement, with its campaigns for electoral reform and the rights of the working classes, was strongly supported in Nottingham, where O'Connor had served as Member of Parliament from 1847 to 1852.
Supporters of O'Connor and the Chartists presented the corporation with petitions clamouring for the erection of a monument to his memory. The issue was hotly debated by the town council, many of whom deplored O'Connor's character and principles, views that were shared by many in Nottingham, who also presented petitions against the monument. But in the end, the corporation decided to erect the statue on the condition that it was viewed as a work of art and not an endorsement of any political party, keeping the Arboretum as neutral public space.
The statue was unveiled before about 500 people on a Monday afternoon, with a passionate speech by the Chartist Ernest Jones, followed by a dinner at St George's Hall. But those opposed to the monument weren't going to give in easily, as the Nottingham Journal reported a few days later.
A disgraceful piece of vandalism was perpetrated in the Arboretum on Friday night last. Our readers are aware that a statue has recently been erected in the Arboretum to Mr. Fergus O'Connor, the Chartist leader. On the night above named, some miscreants entered the grounds and defaced the statue very disgracefully. The injury was first noticed by a servant girl living at one of the houses in Arboretum Street, which overlooks the grounds. On a close inspection, it was found that the face and lower limbs of the figure were daubed with a black adhesive, black substance. The patches had evidently been hastily applied, and a large earthenware coffee pot containing the mixture which had been used was found lying on the ground near the pedestal.
The statue was successfully cleaned by the application of large amounts of turpentine and still stands in the Arboretum today. But it has not been left in peace. Over the years it has suffered many indignities from pigeons and the weather, as well as the hands of vandals. On one occasion it was tarred and feathered, and in March 1940 it was daubed with creosote. It remains an enduring testament to the radically innovative and emotionally charged origins of Nottingham's Arboretum.
That was episode 3 of Our Green and Pleasant Town, written and directed by Karen Wynyard and edited by Katie Jane Clancy, with thanks to Margaret Knowles, Mo Cooper, Jane Tappin, Chris Weir, Martin Gorman, Dinah Wilcox, Jeremy Jago, Malcolm Prosser and Nick Clark for the use of their voices. In the final episode, we delve into the development of the Forest Recreation Ground and the racier attractions it offered the people of Nottingham.